Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Ryan Truchelut of WeatherTiger with you this evening with the very latest on Tropical Storm Helene, which is getting better organized in the Caribbean tonight and is expected to become a hurricane tomorrow in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a major threat to the state of Florida, widespread impacts really across the state. I'm going to give a few minutes here for the audience to filter in, and then I will dig right into what's happening now and what we expect to happen in terms of impacts across the state over the next 3 to 4 days. So sit tight for a couple of minutes, and I'll be right back with the very latest. Okay, folks, if you're just joining, I am Dr. Ryan Truchelut of WeatherTiger. I am a hurricane scientist and forecaster. Been at it for a number of years across the state. I've covered many of the big threats that we have had in the decade, and there have certainly been many. And tonight I'm looking at a system developing in the Caribbean, Tropical Storm Helene, that stands toe to toe with any of the threats that Florida has faced over the past 10 years, or indeed really across hurricane history. So tonight I'm going to walk through the forecast. I'm going to walk through the expected impacts and what's making Helene tick and what's going to drive it up into the Gulf of Mexico and towards the North Florida coastline here over the next 3 days. So this is an infrared satellite shot from space, looking down from a satellite, and those darker colors indicate really intense thunderstorm activity, deep convection, cold cloud tops, indicative of a strengthening storm. So I'm going to start tonight by talking about the key messages from the National Hurricane Center that the forecasters at the NHC want to convey. And of course, the National Hurricane Center is always your go-to source for hurricane information, for warning information, and the very latest on these storms. Key point number one is Helene is forecast to intensify, and it's going to be near hurricane strength as it passes by the Yucatan Peninsula over the next day. Point number two, Helene is expected to rapidly intensify and to grow in size over the Gulf of Mexico. I'm going to come back to this point over and over tonight. Helene is a very large storm. It's going to be a very large storm as it's moving across the Gulf of Mexico. And that really amplifies the human impacts of a storm beyond what category describes. We might be talking about a Category 2 or a Category 3 hurricane, but the impacts are going to be disproportionately high no matter what the category is. So I don't want you to fixate on the category of what Helene reaches over the next couple days, because the impacts are going to be quite severe no matter what the category. So National Hurricane Center wants to convey that there is a danger of life-threatening storm surge because of the size of that storm across the entire west coast of the Florida Peninsula and the Florida Big Bend. That's the number one threat to life. The real killer in storms is water, it's surge. So that's what the Hurricane Center is wanting to draw your attention to. Key point number three is that damaging hurricane force winds are also expected along portions of the coast of the Florida Big Bend, and a hurricane warning is already in effect for a lot of these areas. I'll show exactly where a little bit later, but that includes inland areas like Tallahassee as well. So preparations to protect life and property, even inland, should be complete by early Thursday, because we're going to see weather start to go downhill in that hurricane warning area and the tropical storm warning area as well through the day, through overnight Wednesday into Thursday, and then getting worse as we go later in the day on Thursday. And point number 4 is that Helene is going to bring very heavy rain to and flash and urban flooding across portions of Florida, the southeast, and even into the southern Appalachians and the Tennessee Valley. High risk of flash flooding associated with the heavy rain from this large and powerful storm. So, going to move on to the next point. This is the new experimental forecast cone from the National Hurricane Center. As of the 8 p.m. intermediate advisory, maximum sustained winds are up to 60 miles an hour. That's a tropical storm. Hurricane intensity starts at 74 miles an hour, so it's getting there. And we also have a motion towards the west-northwest at about 12 miles per hour as we go into the overnight hours. But we'll talk a little bit more about that motion as we go forward here. So right now, it's a tropical storm. Helene is expected to become a hurricane as it passes near the Yucatan Peninsula through the Yucatan Channel tomorrow morning into early afternoon. And then overnight, Wednesday into Thursday, as it accelerates north-northeast across the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It's expected to become a Category 3, a major hurricane, by midday on Thursday, and then continue towards the North Florida coastline into the evening and overnight hours Thursday into early Friday. These colors, this fill, that's the inland hurricane watches and warnings here in red and pink, and tropical storm warnings in blue, tropical storm watches in yellow. So this is a new product from the Hurricane Center that highlights that a hurricane is not a point. Look how far outside that cone. The cone only describes the probable tracks of the center. These impacts are occurring far, far outside the cone. So do not fixate on the cone. The cone is not an impacts cone. It's meant to suggest where the center may travel, not where the bad weather is going to be. And that's what you care about. So moving forward, as we talk about the official forecast and how it's changed over the past day, well, it really hasn't changed all that much in the past day. All these lines, the darker the color, the closer it is to now. The forecast going back in time they're these lighter colors. So we've got a day and a half of forecasts, and they really haven't budged. NHC is calling for track towards Appalachia Bay and a landfall sometime later in the day on Thursday. We've drifted a little bit later with that landfall timing since yesterday, now looking more like Thursday evening into overnight rather than Thursday afternoon. But even with that shift, we haven't moved the most likely landfall point all that much. This is the intensity forecast, the last 6 intensity forecasts from the National Hurricane Center, all of which show Helene peaking out as a Category 3 hurricane in the eastern Gulf of Mexico here late in the day on Thursday, and then weakening after it makes landfall, with this period of rapid intensification expected to begin as it moves into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, intensity forecasting, of course, is not perfect. It's prone to errors. Category 2 is a possibility as the peak intensity of the storm, and so is Category 4. So, again, don't fixate on the category of the storm ever, but really especially in this case because of the size, the scope of the impacts that Helene is bringing to bear. So taking a look at what's going on right now in the Caribbean, we have Hurricane Hunter reconnaissance aircraft flying around, and they're taking samples of the wind speed, the wind direction, the pressure, and those observations are being fed back into our models and our forecast to make them better and more accurate. So as this Hurricane Hunter is flying around these kind of alpha-shaped patterns, every time you see a white dot, that's a location of the center. And a couple things to point out here as this NOAA Hurricane Hunter has been flying around tonight is that, one, you can see these dots, these center fixes as we call them, are right on top of each other. We're not seeing a big difference, in an hour and a half between these center fixes. So Helene has kind of stopped moving. It's not moving west-northwest at 10 miles per hour anymore. It may be kind of dawdling. It may be slowing down. And typically, slowing down usually indicates a change of direction is coming up. So we could be seeing Helene make a more northerly move as we go into the early morning hours of tomorrow, and not see this predominantly westward movement that we saw over the course of the day today. Also, these numbers indicating the minimum central pressure of the storm have been falling throughout the day. Earlier today, minimum pressure was around 1,000 millibars. That's dropped about 10 millibars in the past 6 to 8 hours. We're down to around 990 millibars with these center fixes. So that indicates a strengthening tropical storm, perhaps something that's soon to be a hurricane as it moves into that Yucatan Channel. This is a time series of the winds that the hurricane hunters are finding as they fly around. And just very briefly, you can see that these winds that they're finding are on the order of 50 or 60 knots, and that's usually indicating around 60-mile-an-hour sustained wind. So that's where that number is coming from in the NHC advisory. It's these observations that hurricane hunters are taking as they're flying through the storm. So I want to talk a bit right now about what is going to drive the forecast. Why is Helene going to move north into the Gulf of Mexico, and where is it going to go after that? Helene's movement, there's really two keys to the forecast here. One is, kind of as Helene is becoming better defined, it's consolidating, it's becoming more organized. Does it move on land over the Yucatan Peninsula as it's moving northeast through the Yucatan Channel? So here's the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see this is the GFS forecast model. It's just a model. Don't take it at face value. It's just one possible scenario. But tomorrow morning, GFS has this the center of the storm crossing just offshore. But there is some possibility that we move onshore and over land area, and that would be something that would tend to slow down intensification. If we stay out in the channel, well, that's another story. We're not going to have land interaction really causing much of an issue for intensifying as we go into the day on Wednesday. Now, what's going to be responsible for Helene's track as it moves into the Gulf? Two features, very obvious here to see on the 500 millibar winds. That's mid-level winds in the atmosphere. We're talking 3-ish miles up in the atmosphere. You have this big cutoff area of low pressure, and you have a massive ridge of high pressure. The trough, that cutoff low, is over the Mississippi Valley, and the ridge is offshore the Carolinas. So you can see that clockwise flow around the ridge of high pressure. You can see the counterclockwise flow around that trough of low pressure, and that is creating this very neat steering channel that Helene is going to drop into over the next 24 hours. So it doesn't have a lot of degrees of freedom here. You see, these steering currents are quite strong, and there's really not a lot of variability in motion from right to left here as Helene moves into this channel. So it's going to stay in this channel as it moves north across the Gulf of Mexico, and that means it's going to follow a track that basically moves north and then accelerates north-northeast as it moves closer to these upper-level steering features. So it matters where Helene drops into this channel. If it's further west, it may make landfall further west. If it's further east, it may make landfall further east. But it's going to move into this channel of these north and north-northeast moving winds that are just moving pretty quickly across the Gulf of Mexico. So going forward to talk about how that shows up in the models, well, there's not a ton of model disagreement here. Really, this is a short-term, next 12 to 24 hours, and what we see is that most of the model ensemble members are keeping Helene in the Yucatan Channel over water, and just a few at this point are taking it over land. So just kind of hopeful that maybe it would go over land earlier today when a couple of other model runs came in, but it does look like it's going to stay over water, which is unfortunate because that sets up more intensification potential going forward. And one of the reasons I think it is going to stay over water, if you could look at the latest satellite imagery and where the center fixes from the hurricane hunters are finding the center of circulation, the center is right about in there, and it doesn't really appear to be making much more westward progress, just what the hurricane hunters are showing. So if we take a kind of a northwest move across the Yucatan Channel, that does keep it offshore. And I think, unfortunately, I think that's what we're going to see over the next 12 hours. So then if we pick up with the model runs from this afternoon and roll them forward in time, you can see those pretty much every single model. This is a super ensemble of the European model, the American model, the British model, the Canadian models, and all their ensembles, all their kind of slightly tweaked members with slight differences at the beginning to kind of get a sense of how much uncertainty there is in the forecast. There's a lot more uncertainty here, kind of north-south, which is what we would call speed spread. So there's some uncertainty in the timing of that landfall will occur, but there's a lot less kind of cross-track spread. You see that this axis of the ellipse is shorter than that north-south axis. So that means that we're dropping that storm into the channel, and it's going to follow kind of that allotted space in the atmosphere and move north-northeast towards the Big Bend region in general. So, and that the great consensus of all these models and all the ensembles is a track towards Eastern Panhandle, Big Bend, Northern Nature Coast. And I want to emphasize again, this is, if we look at the trends across all the models, or many of the models in time, this is going back the last 2 days, and then this darkest dot that I'm showing here, that's the most recent 12Z run. You can see there has been a little bit of a trend towards a slower progression and a little bit of a progression to the east with time, but not a ton of changes. We can see this ellipse is getting smaller, and that's our uncertainty interval. So as that ellipse gets tighter and tighter, our uncertainty of where the system is going to make, or where Helene's going to make landfall, is going down with time. And that's why there's not a lot of uncertainty in the track forecast. Turning to the intensity forecast, well, you don't want to be staying over water, because these magentas, these purples, it's exceptionally high values of heat content. And that's extremely warm water in the upper 80s on surface, and very deep with that warm water as well. And then this track that Helene will generally be following north and then northeast, it's going to cross this kind of pocket of elevated heat potential in the Gulf of Mexico. It's going to cross the loop current, and it's going to be tracking almost parallel to the orientation of this loop current. So it's going to be in these extremely high heat content waters. Now, oceans can't make storms form from nothing. The atmospheric conditions have to be favorable. So if we look aloft, it's kind of equally alarming here, because these are the upper level winds. Now we're up at about 250 millibars. Now we're 6-7 miles up in the atmosphere, and those upper level winds, what we see is they are rushing away from the storm. So the way a hurricane works is air comes into the center, it goes up through the convection, and then it needs to go somewhere, and it has these excellent upper level outflow features to ventilate all that kind of exhaust as it comes up and out of the storm. So these fast winds, they're really increasing the amount of convection that Helene will be generating through the day on Thursday, and that unfortunately sets us up for potential rapid intensification between late in the day on Wednesday and going into the afternoon hours on Thursday. And all of our models are showing that. We've got a very good agreement between different models, different types of models, that channel is what it's going to be following. The intensity, models do have some differences of opinion on what the peak intensity will be, category 2 or 3 or 4, but they all see a large and intense system because shear is very low, sea surface temperatures and oceanic heat content are very high, and there's plenty of moisture in the mid-levels of the atmosphere to keep that thunderstorm activity firing. So none of which do we like to see. And then just as a final kind of sense of what's the uncertainty, this is the 18Z or kind of late afternoon ensemble run of the European model. It's these 51 ensemble members here. They all are kind of making slight differences to the starting conditions and seeing how that plays out. And those slight differences, you kind of have this range of outcomes from the northern nature coast to western Appalachia Bay for where Helene may be making landfall. So everything is sort of a piece here on a landfall point somewhere in that range. Now, of course, I want to emphasize very clearly Helene is not a point. Helene is going to be a very large hurricane as it crosses the Gulf of Mexico. So this is a figure that shows not only the NHC forecast track here with the hurricane symbols and the line, but these sweeping areas that are swept out by the red, the crimson, and the purple lines. Those are tropical storm force winds, 50-knot winds, and then hurricane force winds here in purple. And just look at how large this area of tropical storm force winds is, extending hundreds of miles out to the east of the center, the eastern half of the storm, and almost all of the Florida Peninsula at some point getting within that tropical storm force wind radius. And even the hurricane force wind radius is quite large as well, as these things go in the NHC forecast. So this is a product that the NHC puts out, those wind radii values that we're plotting here. So Helene is not a point. It will be spreading impacts all across the state of Florida. This is what's called a hurricane threats and impacts product that's put out by the National Weather Service. And it kind of highlights the areas that are at least at risk of seeing certain thresholds of wind value. So these areas that are outlined in yellow are areas that are going to see lower end, have at least the potential for lower end tropical storm force wind gusts of 40 or 50 or 55 miles an hour. And essentially the entire state is in that outline, has the expectation of seeing tropical storm force gusts, at least in the outer bands of Helene. The area in orange has the potential of seeing higher end tropical storm force winds of 60 or 70 miles an hour. And that starts along the coast of southwest Florida. It extends up across coastal west central Florida, up into the northern nature coast, and well inland into South Georgia as well, because Helene will be moving quite quickly as it comes inland. So this is an inland wind threat as well, especially in North Florida and South Georgia. And it's these areas that are highlighted here in red and purple that have at least the potential to see hurricane force wind gusts and even hurricane force sustained winds, most likely in this area highlighted in purple, where there's a potential for wind gusts of 110 miles per hour or greater. And that's really the threshold where you start to see structural damage, even to well-built buildings. You can see roof damage and that kind of thing. Again, not everywhere in this highlighted area in purple is going to see 110 mile per hour wind gusts. It could shift right, it could shift left, but that is the area right now from the NHC forecast where we're at the highest risk of those destructive wind gusts. And you can see it's bumping right up against Tallahassee in that area where there's a potential for wind gusts of greater than 110 miles an hour. Well, because of that, the National Hurricane Center is not fooling around. National Weather Service is not fooling around, and they have issued watches and warnings over much of the state of Florida for tropical storm and hurricane force winds. These areas highlighted in crimson here, from Gulf County across Gadsden, Leon, all the way down here along the Nature Coast to just north of Tampa Bay. This is your region of where you're already under a hurricane warning, and that's the expectation of hurricane force winds occurring somewhere within this area, and the onset of potentially disruptive weather conditions within 36 hours. So you basically have 36 hours to prepare for hurricane force winds in that area. This area outlined in pink is under a hurricane watch, and we have tropical storm warnings further south along the coast and inland, including for the Orlando area. Tropical storm warnings and hurricane watches in effect for Tampa right now. That could be bumped up to a hurricane warning later. We'll see. So widespread watches and warnings well ahead of the storm, indicative of the need to get ready for it. And just to illustrate why those watches and warnings are so widespread, this is the GFS, just the model's opinion of where the storm will be located early Thursday afternoon. And you can see this huge area, these bright greens. These are tropical storm force winds, and you have tropical storm force wind gusts even along the Atlantic coast here. wind gusts easily into the 40 and 50 mile an hour range, which is why a tropical storm watch or warning is in effect for even for the Atlantic coast. Uh, but the west coast of Florida here, even with this storm staying potentially 50, 75, 100 miles offshore, those winds are raking the west coast of Florida, and it's over a very widespread area. This isn't the same kind of thing as Ian coming into Charlotte Harbor, but these are tropical storm force winds, and there's certainly something to be taken seriously. So as we go forward in time, then one step further to GFS opinion of where landfall may be occurring somewhere in Appalachia Bay. Don't get fixated on the landfall point here, but this is Thursday evening, and again, you're seeing this huge sweep of these very powerful tropical storm force winds here, and then hurricane force winds kind of in this area, onshore flow over a wide section of the west Florida coastline, Florida Gulf Coast. And that onshore flow, that's a dangerous, dangerous thing, as we're going to get to in just a minute here as I discuss the storm surge threat. Just one last point about the winds and the size of the storm. One thing I can't do at this point, I cannot say exactly who is going to get the core of Helene as it makes landfall. We don't know if it's going to be making landfall as a Category 2, Category 3, something else. So we don't know exactly how strong this core will be, but the really, truly destructive winds happen in this core, and we don't know that'll be what the HAFS-B model is showing here, where it's coming up into Appalachia Bay, eastern Appalachia Bay. This could shift down the coast more towards Cedar Key, northern Nature Coast. We don't know that, but there's this range of 40, 50, 60 mile wide radius someone is going to get hit by this. We don't know exactly who at this point, but it's likely to happen somewhere between kind of Panama City and then down just north of down to the Tampa area. So let's talk about storm surge. Let's talk about what that onshore flow is capable of doing. This is the peak storm surge forecast from the National Hurricane Center as of the 5 p.m. advisory. They are updating these estimates of potential peak surge each 6 hours. So at the 5s and 11s is when you will get new projections for this. And eastern Appalachia Bay, northern Nature Coast, that's your area of greatest risk of 10 to 15 feet of storm surge. Now, 10 to 15 feet of storm surge in these low-lying areas of the northern Nature Coast, Appalachia Bay, Big Bend, the land is not 15 feet above ground for many miles inland here. So that water is going to come far, far inland. So if you are in Appalachia Bay, if you are along the Nature Coast, if you're in Tampa Bay and you're receiving an evacuation order, you need to follow it, because a huge chunk of these coastal counties under this scenario are going to be completely underwater. And it's just a reality of the storm being so large that it's not even particularly sensitive to, oh, this became a 4 and this happened. It could do these numbers at Category 2 intensity easily. It's not predicated on rapid intensification to becoming a Category 4. So please take this forecast seriously. Get out of the path of this storm if you are in these low-lying areas. And again, these numbers that are being forecast now for Tampa Bay, further south to Bradenton, Sarasota, we're talking about 5 to 8 feet of storm surge, even with a path that's 100 miles offshore Tampa Bay. If that shifts closer, that number would change as well. So I want to illustrate what that would look like if we shift that path. So first, this is one model estimate. If Helene follows the National Hurricane Center's forecast, track, intensity, and wind radii perfectly, we're following this track that brings it inland, up Appalachia Bay, inland somewhere in the St. Mark's vicinity. That's what the NHC track shows right now. These areas highlighted in maroon, those are areas where you have the expectation of 10 or more feet of storm surge. So it's a huge swath of central and eastern Appalachia Bay and the northern Nature Coast where you have truly life-threatening surge. And look how far inland that surge is penetrating, well inland in all of these coastal counties. And again, even under this scenario, Tampa Bay coming up with these oranges and yellows, which are 5 to 8 feet of storm surge. That's going to put a lot of folks underwater in Pinellas and Hillsborough County as well. So if you're living in an evacuation zone in Pinellas or Hillsborough, or further south in Sarasota, Manatee County, pay very close attention to this forecast and pay very close attention to those evacuation orders and heed them. So now I'm going to shift this forecast track a bit to the east. And what if the forecast track shifts, and instead of a track, the NHC forecast track along this red line, more in the direction of Tallahassee or Perry, what if the forecast track is over here towards Cedar Key? You have a Cedar Key landfall. Well, that would be good news for Appalachia Bay. Appalachia Bay would then be seeing offshore winds at the strongest part of the storm, and that would result in very limited highest storm surge, probably some, you'd have anti-surge, you'd have water going away from the coast during the heart of the storm. But it dramatically increases the storm surge here in southwest Florida, Fort Myers, Charlotte Harbor, Sarasota, Tampa, really north to the Nature Coast. Now we're talking about, if you shift this track, now you're 50 miles east of Tampa instead of 100 miles east of Tampa. You're putting out 6 to 10 feet of storm surge along much of the west central and southwest coast of Florida. So, that's well within the cone of uncertainty. That's well within the normal forecast error that you might see in a National Hurricane Center forecast. So that's something that you need to be thinking about and preparing for. We're all hoping for the best, but this is a very serious situation, and you should be preparing for the worst. And hey, if you're in these areas and you're in an evacuation zone and the storm surge doesn't happen, hey, you won. Great news. You maybe inconvenienced yourself, but the alternative would be putting your life in danger. So now let's show the alternate scenario. I think this one is a bit less likely, just in my opinion, but what if we shift this track further to the west and we have a landfall somewhere in the Panama City region? Well, look what happens to these areas of Appalachia Bay and the northern Nature Coast that are 50, 100, 150 miles away from Panama City. This huge swath of strong winds, onshore winds pushing into Appalachia Bay still results in this enormous storm surge of 10 feet or more in Appalachia Bay. So I want to emphasize, if you're listening to me tonight from Appalachia Bay, if the track was to shift west away from you, it's not a victory. It's not a win. We'd still be looking at, our best models would still be showing extremely significant life-threatening storm surge across Appalachia Bay, even with that shift. And even under this circumstance where the track was to shift to the left, you'd still have dangerous storm surge of 3 to 6 feet or more in Pinellas and Hillsborough County as well. Not as much then along southwest Florida coastline. So I hope that gives some sense of what the range of uncertainty here is, and how these risks, especially to Appalachia Bay and the northern Nature Coast, really aren't very sensitive to these shifts east or west that may occur with the forecast track. One other piece of information, to my chagrin, the high tide timing for Cedar Key here, for kind of Appalachia Bay generally and the Nature Coast, high tide on Thursday is right around 11:30 at night, heading into late Thursday and then into early Friday. The low tide is about 4:30 in the afternoon, and then you have a couple feet of tide coming in. And probable landfall timing is late in the day on Thursday. So this is not helpful timing with the expected timing of landfall. We'll see if that shifts around, but right now this doesn't look great. We really lucked out with Idalia. Idalia came in right at low tide, and it was, again, Idalia was a much smaller storm than this, much smaller wind radii. So just finally to emphasize that, drive that point home, these areas highlighted here in magenta, those are your storm surge warning areas, and they extend from Apalachicola all the way down to the Everglades. So it's NHC is taking this very seriously. I know local emergency managers are taking this very seriously, and if you're in a storm surge warning area, you should be taking it seriously and making your evacuation plans now. You'll have another good weather day tomorrow to travel if you need to. So please get out. We may have a passing rain shower or two tomorrow, but it's not going to be widespread bad weather coming in until Thursday. And finally, the last risk I want to cover is the risk of flash flooding. Now, uh, because Helene will be coming in at a pretty rapid clip here, maybe 15, 20 miles an hour, it's not going to stall. It's not going to put down uh, 15, 20 inches of rainfall, but it is large, so you'll have this long period of rainfall that adds up to, in these areas highlighted in yellow, you're getting at least 4 inches of rainfall across most of Georgia, most of North Florida. Very likely to see that. These areas in yellow, kind of yellowy orange and orange, you're looking at 6 or 8 inches or more of rainfall there as well. And again, I want to highlight the flooding risks up here in North Georgia, western North Carolina as well, because all that upsloping air getting forced up the mountains is going to cause rain to be quite heavy up in the mountains as well. So major flash flooding risks there too. Adding it up, the flash flood risks as you kind of factor in how saturated the soil is. We have seen a lot of recent rainfall in Tallahassee. Soil's very saturated. That's also not going to be good for trees, root balls coming out of the ground either. But in terms of the flood risks, it's this area highlighted in red where flash flooding is most likely to occur with the storm. Finally, I'm going to wrap this up tonight by offering a historical perspective here. Uh, this is not common. This is not something that we can go back in the historical record and find a lot of similar storms in the past. Assuming that the NHC forecast is correct and we do get to Category 3 intensity at landfall, there's really only a handful of precursors to this. There's storms in 1851, 1877, 1894, 1896, and then nothing for 120 years, and then Michael and Idalia. Idalia was the first ever Category 3 hurricane to come up into Appalachia Bay. So just not a lot of precursors to this. If you lived through Michael in Tallahassee, Michael was a Cat 5 at landfall, but again, Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. It's based on the maximum wind somewhere in the storm. Tallahassee saw wind gusts of 70 to 80 miles per hour in Michael. So you did not survive Category 5 hurricane conditions if you were in Tallahassee during Hurricane Michael. So it can get worse. If think about if you're in Tallahassee, think about how Mariana looked after Tallahassee, that after Michael, and that's kind of the worst case scenario for Tallahassee. Better case scenario for Tallahassee is that the track shifts south and east away, and then we'll still see, of course, damaging wind gusts, but potentially not the core of the storm. It's just too early for me to say in Tallahassee whether that eye wall is coming here. It's just we're not at that point yet, but it's something that I'm right there with you and wishing and hoping and rooting against it. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up. I've talked for quite a while tonight about the many threats that Helene presents. I just want to see if there's a few questions. Latest recommended time to evacuate from Tallahassee. I think you can evacuate through tomorrow night quite safely, and even into the very early morning on Thursday, because the landfall timing is Thursday evening into the overnight hours. So certainly you'll have good driving conditions tomorrow. If you're evacuating, if you're in a house where there's overhanging trees, tall pines, tall oaks, and they could come down on your house, evacuation is certainly something to consider. I would go west. I would go west towards Mobile or Pensacola. You might get some rain there, but it's not going to be. There's really not potential of getting that destructive core. So yes, you can evacuate Tallahassee through tomorrow night and probably even into tomorrow morning. Is it possible that Helene could take a turn like Ian did? No, it's not. And the reason why it's not possible is this giant ridge of high pressure off the Carolina coast. And you can see this is not going anywhere. Ian pulled one of these, came up, I messed up Ian's track there, but Ian did this. Well, it started from here and then kind of looped like this, made that hard turn northeast. There wasn't a huge ridge out here deflecting it away, so it was able to make that northeast turn. Helene is going to follow this north and then north-northeast channel between the low and the high. So no, Two-part answer: no, it's not going to make landfall in Southwest Florida, but we don't know if it's going to move close enough to West Central Florida to cause, major surge issues in Southwest Florida. So um, that would be that answer there. Can we tell if it's going to be stronger than a 3 after it spends time in the warm Gulf? Well, we don't know yet. Rapid intensification, it's tough to know how far it goes once it starts. NHC is calling for a 3. I think that's a fair assessment. A category up or down from there is certainly possible. But again, don't fixate on the category here, because if it's a 2, it'll be a giant one with a huge area of 30, 35, 50 knot winds, out of the south, uh, piling that water into the shore. All right, I'm going to wrap up here. I'll be at it through um, through the storm, through Helene, until uh, as long as the storm is a threat and I can forecast, I'll be doing it. So um, tomorrow is your day to prepare. It's good weather conditions. Get everything that you need to get done. Get out if you're in an evacuation zone. Don't mess with this one. All right. Well, that's it for tonight. I'm Dr. Ryan Truchelut of WeatherTiger, and keep watching the skies. Stay safe, Florida.